Good evening and welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. My name is Joe Crane, Director of Public Programs here at the ALPLM. I'm so glad to have you along on this, what is turning out to be a toasty Thursday evening in Central Illinois and across a good chunk of the Midwest as well. And I understand it's only going to get hotter this weekend. So folks, if you're planning a big Juneteenth celebration, a lot of folks now having the day off tomorrow with between the state of Illinois declaring Juneteenth a state holiday, and now today President Biden signing into law the proclamation that tomorrow will be Juneteenth celebration nationwide. So an important date in our nation's history, and we're commemorating that tonight with a special program themed toward the Juneteenth celebration. Of course, right now you can see the Emancipation Proclamation signed by Abraham Lincoln, one of about a dozen copies that still exist, on display every day from 9 until 5 here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, all the way through July 6th. Of course, if you're looking to get tickets in advance to visit the museum, please do so. PresidentLincoln.illinois.gov is where you can find ticket information. And with the fact that we're now into Phase 5, Illinois fully open after the COVID pandemic, you have the opportunity just to simply walk up and purchase your tickets at the door as you come into the museum. But we still encourage folks to get tickets in advance. That way you can get into the museum a lot faster to be able to see the incredible legacy of President Lincoln that we share with the world here at the ALPLM. Tonight's program on Facebook Live entitled Pathways to Freedom, the Underground Railroad and the Illinois Freedom Project. Of course, we invite you to let us know where you're watching from around the state and around the country tonight in the comments section of Facebook. And as we go through the next hour or so, if you have some questions for our gathered group of historians and experts, please post those in the comments as well, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we possibly can. So to introduce the rest of our guests tonight on the panel, let's hand it over to our Illinois and Midwest Studies historians here at the ALPLM, Dr. Jacob K. Freefeld. Good evening, Jake.
Thank you, Joe. It's lovely being here again with you. I think I've spent 3 nights with you on Facebook Live this month, and I always love coming back. And as you said, as we head into this Juneteenth weekend, we thought we'd offer a program that deals with the Black Freedom Movement, but because the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library is also the Illinois State Historic Library, we thought we'd focus more on the Black Freedom Movement in the Midwest and Illinois, particularly before emancipation. And I've got 2 great people from the National Park Service with me today. Day Johnson, who is the Midwest coordinator on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom project. And I always mess that up, and I hope I got it right this time. And Tim Townsend from the Lincoln Home, who is also with the Illinois Freedom Project. And I just want to thank both of you for joining me and Joe on Facebook Live tonight.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for having us, and I'm glad to join remotely.
And it's working. I think just to get us started, it might be useful to have both of you, in whichever order you'd want, to tell us a little bit about your 2 projects that you're working on.
Go ahead, Dave. You want to start?
So I'm with the National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom program, and I hope some of you out there have heard of us before, but we were established in 1998, and we set and promote quality standards in the coordination of education, preservation, and commemoration efforts related to the history of the Underground Railroad, which the program defines as resistance to enslavement through escape and flight. And the Underground Railroad, some people say, oh, the Underground Railroad was in operation from the 1830s till the Civil War, but the way that we look at it is the Underground Railroad was in operation from the earliest times people were enslaved until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery. The movement includes those who escaped, which we refer to as freedom seekers, and those who assisted them in their efforts. We consider it the nation's first civil rights movement. And part of the network is that we have what we call the Network to Freedom, which is a listing of sites, facilities, and programs which have a verifiable association with the Underground Railroad. Currently, there are over 680 Network to Freedom listings in 39 states, plus Washington, D.C. and the Virgin Islands. The sites are what we call, those are the actual places associated with the Underground Railroad history. Then we have programs which interpret and educate about the history of the Underground Railroad. Then we have facilities. which probably the Abraham Lincoln Library and Museum should be one, but they currently aren't. So this is my shameless plug to try to get you guys listed, which contain kind of the documentary resources that can further our understanding of this important history. If you look at slide 2, which looks at the state, you'll notice that Illinois has currently 25 listings. As you well know, probably everybody who's listening knows, that's not necessarily indicative of the rich history that Illinois has regarding the Underground Railroad. There should be a lot more. I just mentioned one. I won't mention all of them because that's a discussion for another day, but I really think Illinois should be better represented for its important history to the Underground Railroad and in telling what we consider to be an important migration story. And I'll let Tim talk a little bit about the Illinois Freedom Project now.
Thanks, Dane. Thanks for having me as part of this program. It's always a pleasure to be in this facility with you guys, and any time to work with my colleague Day is great. So the Illinois Freedom Project is a program that really came out of, I'm going to jump ahead here, of what I learned in researching Jameson Jenkins, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was a neighbor of Lincoln's, lived just down the street. Didn't really know too much about him, I'm embarrassed to say, but one of the first things we did was get the Jenkins lot, the house no longer stands, but the Jenkins lot included in the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And so in wanting to learn more about Jenkins, and I'm an Illinois native, grew up in a little town of Stockton up in Joe Davis County, and there's so much of this African-American history in Illinois that I didn't know growing up, you know, and I thought it was problematic that I knew Lincoln's shoe size, but I didn't know that there were such things as black codes in Illinois, for example. And so we jumped in to, you know, starting with research and pulling together the stories, and it's just skimming the surface, and everything from when the French first introduced slavery into the Illinois country on up through Chicago and Bronzeville and the Great Migration and everything in between. So we pulled together the research. Then we worked on a website to present the information and printed materials. And we've always worked with young people in presenting history, but we really were intentional about presenting this African American history, working with folks like Justin Blanford over at the old state capitol. And so we put together some videos to go on with the web page. And then working with youth mentoring organizations from throughout Springfield, like the Boys and Girls Club and the Outlet and many others, we loaded up a charter bus and went on a trip throughout Illinois to visit some of these Illinois Freedom locations. So, and it's an ongoing effort. It's an ongoing project to explore, experience, and get to the relevancy of these stories to today.
And what does this research look like? You're doing most of that at the Lincoln home, or is it broader than?
It's broader. It's much broader. You know, with national parks or any historic sites, you really end up really tightly focused, you know, on a particular story. For us, of course, it's the Lincoln family in the 17 years they lived at the home, which is a very important story. But we broadened that out and not only thematically, but also in the research and the facilities that we visited to pull together that research, you know, relying a lot on secondary sources as well.
And just to go back for a second, you mentioned the Jenkins home isn't standing anymore.
Right.
Is there? Do you know what it looks like, and is there any movement to maybe replicate it?
Yeah, well, we partnered with the Illinois State Museum and the good folks there, and did 3 summer seasons doing archaeological testing of the site, and confirmed what we thought we knew through other maps and other documents of what the house may have looked like. And then we worked with a gentleman by the name of John Amakawa to develop an augmented reality virtual tour of the lot to put the house back. People can look through their phone or their tablet, and virtually the house is back with little vignettes. And maybe someday we'll reconstruct the structure itself, but you know, that's part of the challenge of these stories is so often the places associated with these stories don't exist, and aren't those substantial homes, and so often with cultural resources, as we call it, and what the Park Service does and the state with historic sites, it's what's left. So we have to be more intentional, I think, about representing and telling the stories of people whose homes no longer exist, or the structures no longer exist related to them.
Yeah, let's get into some of those stories and places. Because I think when a lot of people think of the Underground Railroad, they think of these bastions of abolitionism, perhaps New England, some routes that go east and then into Canada. What would the Underground Railroad have looked like in the Midwest and Illinois? What are some of the sites? And maybe even, if either you could speak to, when we think railroad, we think stops with like schedules. Is that the case, or is it more improvisational than that? It's like a four-part question.
Yeah, that's a long question. So with the Midwest, so of course people like to think of New England and Canada, but if you look at that map of Underground Railroad routes, right? The Underground Railroad not only went north, it went west, it went south, it went everywhere. And sometimes it really was kind of what opportunities were available. It's not like you had a route. One of my favorite stories is there's a story of these 3 tunnels, right? People always like tunnels, these secret hiding places. There's 3 tunnels in upstate New York, and everybody said they were used on the Underground Railroad. And it was like, well, how were they used? Did they have like signs that said, okay, if your name is A through M, you go through this tunnel, if your name, you know what I mean? Because they were all just right next to each other. So people kind of have that conception, but really it was about, a lot of times when people provided Underground Railroad assistance, it's not like they necessarily planned to. They were faced with it in a moment with someone needing assistance, and they had to make that decision whether or not to help that person. Now, over time, we know that the Underground Railroad did get increasingly more deliberate, particularly as it moved west to the Midwest and even further west. And so then you get to see more deliberation. And we see that it's really a migration story, because if you look at some of the counties in Illinois, they'll say we trace our Underground Railroad involvement to the migration of people from a community in Ohio that was very involved in the Underground Railroad. So we see it becoming increasingly deliberate and about people moving out, and they're not moving necessarily for the Underground Railroad, but of course if they were committed to this anti-slavery struggle, they would have brought it with them wherever they migrated to. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the story of the Underground Railroad in the Midwest, particularly since you have people migrating out. It's often not necessarily looking, when you're looking at someone's Underground Railroad activity, it's not necessarily looking about what happened particularly in that location. It's looking about where they migrated from and where they migrated to. It's a much larger story than we like to talk about. And I think sometimes, when we're looking about Underground Railroad, we get so locked into our location, right, where we live or where we're located. But really the Underground Railroad, because it's a migration story, you can't understand it without understanding where people are coming from and going to. It's not like the enslaved people who escaped started off in your place. They had to come from somewhere, and sometimes they did settle in these communities, but most often they went to someplace else. So we really don't have a true understanding of the Underground Railroad unless we look at this larger migration. And so I think that's one of the things. Did I answer all your questions? I know there was a lot in there.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job. Yeah. So within that migration, then, where are folks who are coming through Illinois, and where are they ending up? Based on the map, it looks like maybe Michigan. I'm a little bit farther from the map.
Yeah. So people go from Illinois to Michigan. It just depends where they happen to be. And sometimes if slave traders in the area, they're going to have to be flexible, right? Fluid with the decisions, where they might decide, okay, I was planning to go north, but now I'll need to go deviate a little bit more west and then go back east. But sometimes people start off in Illinois and took detours through Indiana. It's very weird sometimes the way that things happened in the Underground Railroad. And we know, we call it the Underground Railroad, and sometimes people go, well, it wasn't Underground Railroad. It wasn't underground, nor was it a railroad. But the railroads were so important to Illinois' Underground Railroad story. And I think that's something that gets missed, that people were using the actual railroads in their journeys and to go in their travel to get from one place to another.
That's incredible. I've seen a couple stories about steamboats as well being important, that second nature system of mastering the rivers and the railroads. Now, what sites in Illinois are we talking about that would be important?
Well, there's several, but one of the ones that we look at that's kind of a traditional, what people traditionally think about as Underground Railroad is the Richard L's house. And I'm sorry that I spelled his name wrong on the slide. It should be 2 E's and 2 L's. But he was a doctor there in Quincy, Illinois, which was kind of a stronghold of abolitionist activity. And in 1842, an enslaved man named Charlie crossed over from Missouri into Illinois, and he was brought to Richard L's house by a free African-American man. And Richard L's and the freedom seeker ended up getting caught. And Richard L's was actually prosecuted for his involvement in the Underground Railroad. The case went to court, and Stephen Douglas was the judge in that case. For those of you Lincoln fans out there, he was fined $400. He appealed the case first to the state Supreme Court, and the case ended up going all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But unfortunately, before the case was heard before the U.S. Supreme Court, Dr. L's had died. But that was kind of that's kind of what we think of, like these houses, right, of these people, and they were involved in the Underground Railroad. They provided safe houses, or they were conductors, and they helped transfer people to the next stop. But one of the things that we like to try to focus on, because even you see this in the Richard L's story, is that free African Americans were essential to the operations of the Underground Railroad. So that's one of the things that we try to do in getting these stories out, is to talk about African American involvement. And people don't realize that oftentimes that was kind of the front line of defense. When freedom seekers came into different states, quote, free states, they first relied on people of color, and then people of color would put them into contact with sympathetic people who could help them on the rest of their journeys. And so we see places like free African-American communities like New Philadelphia, which you see pictured there. And that was founded in 1836. It was the first town that was legally registered by an African-American. And he not only was he instrumental in gaining his own freedom, but he eventually helped to gain the freedom of 16 of his family members. But the town was also active on the Underground Railroad. And New Philadelphia shares kind of a lot of characteristics of what we consider kind of free African-American communities that were involved in the Underground Railroad. They were a remote landscape, proximity to a river or a slave state, in this case, Missouri. And they were often located on not only the border between a slave and a free state, but they were also located in borderlands of the county where they're located. So they're located usually between two counties. And we see this in places like not only New Philadelphia, but Rocky Fork, Brooklyn, and Miller Grove, which are all there in Illinois. And what's interesting, I know when we focus on African Americans' involvement in the Underground Railroad, we're not trying to discount white participation, but what we're trying to do is to broaden the story, because it helps us better understand what was a complex and nuanced movement. And it was a grassroots movement. And we have people, uniting across lines of race, gender, religion, and class, and they were all uniting in the hopes of promoting social change. But often when we think about the Underground Railroad, we think of traditionally, right, it constructed in terms of kind of white benevolence. And people of African descent are considered passive recipients of the movement. And so they're often nameless and faceless, except a few, of course, like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. And what happens is that African Americans or people of African descent became secondary characters in what was largely a story about their struggles for freedom and self-determination. And this got caught up in kind of that post-Civil War narrative of freedom, emancipation being a gift and not something that was earned and fought for by people of African descent. So we always try to talk about African American agency, both as the freedom seekers making that often difficult decision to flee bondage, but also those who assisted them on their journeys.
How difficult is it to do that? Because a lot of the sources, because in our own collection, we have an account of an Underground Railroad account, I think written by Julius Willard, who helped someone to freedom and then was fined, much like Els was. But again, that's a source written by a white guy after the fact. When a lot of the the writing about this stuff is from the white participants. How difficult is it to find and recover those black voices in the Underground Railroad?
It is difficult, of course, but what's interesting is when we see a lot of those stories, like the one you mentioned by Willard, that a lot of them are, in a way, they're talking about the black people who were involved in the Underground Railroad. Now, normally the freedom seekers remain kind of nameless and faceless, you know, in those stories, but they are talking about people of color in their communities that were instrumental. I'm thinking, if you look at some of the Siebert papers, they talk about a free African-American man who lived nearby that helped and assisted people. So you do get those, and we do know the name of the person, the free African-American man that helped Els. So they are there in different ways. And sometimes, you know, people often think the Underground Railroad happened in secret, so we can't know about it. But there's a lot more information than we think that is out there. And it's really about kind of, corroborating your sources. Sometimes a lot of census information is important. Looking at, well, who are the free blacks there in the community? Who could this be when you see an account referred to someone like that? And it's often, you know, the Underground Railroad is about connections, right? Think about, you're involved in kind of an illicit secret activity. Who are you going to trust? You're going to trust people that you already have established bonds with. So these relationships exist through church, through different societies, usually through your business relationships, people who you knew in towns like that you migrated from, right? And their extended family members. Even when we look at someone like John Brown, right? If we look at those who he depended on in his activities on the Underground Railroad, they're most likely either relatives or people that he knew back from when he migrated from New York or Ohio, or they're kind of his extended family members on either his mother or father's side. So really, you know, the reason we call it the Network to Freedom is because it really is about a network of people working together, and those relationships and established ties are so important in understanding those. So looking at, oh, you know, sometimes you hear one name of a person, but then you've got to look, you kind of have to do a genealogy of the Underground Railroad to really get at it, to say, how are these people related? Are they involved in the same church? Do they come from the same place? Those all become instrumental in kind of what we call triangulating the data, right? You have this one story, right? People think, oh, it's a crazy Underground Railroad story. And there might be some crazy elements in some of these Underground Railroad stories you hear, but by digging down and kind of looking for kind of those specific elements and then diving deeper into those, we really are able to come up with a rich Underground Railroad history that starts really destroying some of the myth and getting at the true Underground Railroad story, which is a story about people. So I know people are always looking for a tunnel or a secret hiding place or a trap door. I always tell people it's not about those kind of architectural details, as exciting as they may be. It's really a story about people, and it's only when we get to the story of those people that we really truly understand the Underground Railroad.
And so, speaking of those people, I mean, we have the connection to the Jameson Jenkins house, he's a middle class black, almost neighbor of Lincoln's, right? And so, where does that site fit in this network? And that's for either of you, because I know we're talking about both the network and the Lincoln home site.
Well, and Dave, jump in, but you know, Jenkins is a good example of that connection. There's also his in-laws, the Blanks family, came from in the mid to late 1830s, from North Carolina through southern Indiana, the Beach Settlement, then into Illinois. North Carolina's constitution was changing to where free blacks would need to get out of there, even though it was a slave state, you know, to Illinois, and then those connections were built, I think, through that. There were others that came from North Carolina, people like John Jones, and then the Blanks family ended up in Chicago. They were advocating while they were still in Springfield for access to education for African American children, while Jenkins was associated with, you know, the Underground Railroad, and then the Blanks moved up to Chicago before the Civil War, and were also advocates for African American rights. And so those connections were there as well. And then we know in New Philadelphia there were people also that came from North Carolina, the Beach Settlement, to New Philadelphia. So those connections, I think, you know, they're just there. It's amazing how many, to me anyway, just within the circle, the Lincoln Research Circle, you have people like John Jones, Jenkins, Blanks, Reverend Brown, who worked for the Lincolns, all had that North Carolina connection. So there's something more there yet. I think that, and Day and I have talked about this, more research needs to be done in that area as well.
And Lincoln, and Lincoln's interesting too because he's surrounded right by these abolitionist folks, but it keeps the movement at arm's length. Objects when the legislature tries to denounce abolitionism, but not strenuously.
Right.
Do we have any questions from the audience yet, Joe?
Not at this point, but I will add we have a lot of folks watching from all over Illinois and from around the country as well. Seeing viewers tonight not only from throughout Illinois, but Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, a couple of different folks from Florida. Looks like Des Moines, Iowa checking in with us tonight, as are some folks from numerous communities, including the Chicago area here throughout the state. One of the coolest comments, Kelly said she's watching with 8-year-old granddaughter from Florida, originally from Illinois, loves history. That's what we like to see in a program like this, the opportunity to share such incredible history with such young people that are becoming aware of their past and hopefully making a better future. We do invite folks to let us know where you're watching from tonight throughout the state and across the country, even around the world. Just comment in the section below. Of course, if you have a question for any of our historians tonight, please let us know in the comments, and we'll pass those comments and questions along as soon as we can.
Now, there are a few different ways I think we could turn here. We could just keep talking about sites, but I think there's a subtext going through this right now where we're talking about folks fleeing to Illinois as if Illinois at this, like in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, is this bastion of freedom. What's going on? Because people are getting fined, right, for helping people escape slavery. So what's going on in Illinois, and is this one-way traffic on the Underground Railroad? How much tension is there in the state?
So I think all states are complicated when we talk about the Underground Railroad, of course. Illinois became a destination on the Underground Railroad because dating back to the Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited slavery from existing in its borders. But we know slavery existed within Illinois, right? From colonial times, both under the French and the British, slavery existed. Both people of Native American descent and African descent were enslaved in Illinois. So I think sometimes when we're talking about slavery, we create this kind of false construction, right? South slave, North free, but these simple narratives kind of distort the history. Slavery existed practically everywhere in the North, South, East, and West, and Illinois. And I think one of the things that people had vested interests in slavery in Illinois, right? Even if Illinois was not a slave state. And we know that people held people in bondage in Illinois up until the 1840s. And we have two of the sites that we could show. One is the Knox County, Illinois site, which was associated with some legal proceedings that stemmed from an 1842 escape from Randolph County, in which a man named Andrews Borders was holding people of African descent in bondage, and they escaped on the Underground Railroad, made their way to Knox County, where they were assisted by abolitionists, and he came up to reclaim his enslaved property. So we see people holding slaves, them escaping, and them still being able to reclaim them in Illinois, despite it being a free state. And if we look at the Crenshaw House, the old slave house there in Gallatin County, right? The man there, Crenshaw, had a vested interest. He was a businessman there in Southern Illinois, and he was involved in not only slave trading, but he was kidnapping free blacks. And that kind of deals with kind of the liminal position of free blacks. Even though they're free, because of kind of the complex racism that existed, they weren't completely free, right? And even before the 1850 fugitive slave law, you see free blacks being kidnapped and being taken back down south. And Crenshaw was implicated twice in the 1820s and 1840s for kidnapping free blacks and trading them essentially deeper south. And so I think, it was always dangerous for free blacks there in Illinois, even though there was a lot of, anti-slavery activity, but because of kind of the complex notions about race and just by, your race, you could, being a person of color, you were assumed that you could be a slave. And you could not testify in court. So let's say you were arrested as a free person, it would be very hard for you to prove your freedom. So it really depended on sympathetic whites coming to your aid in order to help protect that freedom that you had fought and earned. And so I think it's, we have to think about Illinois. Yes, it was this quote, free state, but there were a lot of kind of complications and nuances to that idea of it being a free state.
Yeah, and a lot of times folks are held as indentured servants, right? But they're technically still enslaved until in the 1848 Constitution eventually makes that illegal. Unless you're a prisoner, right? There's still this wiggle room within that Constitution as well. I think we have a question from the audience.
Yes, several actually coming in, and we can kind of sprinkle these in. But Margaret wants to know, what is the history of Shawneetown and the Cumberland Presbyterian Church in the Underground Railroad?
Ooh, what county is that in?
That's in Gallatin County, down in southeastern Illinois, right along the Ohio River.
Oh, so in the same county where the slave house is?
Yes.
I don't know much about that particular site. I would love to know more, and if it should be listed in the network, I would love to see it represented. I don't know much about that site.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure either on the specific site, but also not too far from the Crenshaw House in Shawneetown is Miller Grove in Shawnee National Forest, which was an African American community. As Day indicated, with just like New Philadelphia, it was near the Ohio River, and it was a small but vibrant African American community that certainly must have assisted as well with folks traveling further north along the Underground Railroad. But that Shawneetown, I'm just not specifically sure either.
It's interesting that it is a Presbyterian site because, right, that's very much part of this revolution in the mind of Americans changing their minds on slavery at this time as the Second Great Awakening and people starting to reconsider as part of reform movements things like alcohol, but as well as slavery. And so it's not surprising to me that might be a site that would be important.
Yeah, there's definitely certain kind of religious affiliations that you always go, oh, if you hear about them, it piques your interest. So Presbyterian, Congregationalists, United Church of the Brethren, of course, Quakers, the Friends. So there's several. The Free Baptists are another one, and they're quite popular there in Illinois. And I think there was a Free Baptist church near Barry, Illinois, which is where New Philadelphia was associated with, and the McWhorters were part of that congregation. So there's certain kind of religious denominations that you hear that you're like, oh, there's a good chance. I wouldn't throw it out the window, but more investigation would be needed to show that there was a definite connection with the Underground Railroad. So I would love to hear more about that community and see if we can see if that there is any documentation for them being involved in the Underground Railroad.
Do y'all often find that these sacred sites are important in these networks to freedom?
Definitely. And, I mentioned white congregations, but the AME Church was essential to Underground Railroad operations. And I think we have a couple of AME churches pictured there in the slideshow. First in Quincy with Mother Priscilla Baltimore, who, she was a formerly enslaved woman who gained her freedom. She worked on the Underground Railroad. The church is actually believed to have been built on her property where her house stood, and it was believed to be in her basement where she hid freedom seekers. But it's hard pressed to find an AME church that was not involved in the Underground Railroad. And then I don't know if you guys know Dr. Cheryl LaWersh. She believes that the AME church, particularly with Bishop William Paul Quinn's West, is essential to the spreading of Underground Railroad activities throughout Black churches east of Pennsylvania. West of Pennsylvania. Sorry, I said east of Pennsylvania. West of Pennsylvania.
Not much real estate east of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
But I do a lot of studying of Black towns in the West post Civil War, and it strikes me that the AME Church is usually the first building to go up in a lot of those towns. I think we have more questions, Joe?
Yes, indeed. Shirley wants to know, did anyone traveling on the railroad have a leader, or did some go alone, make just a trip by themselves on the Underground Railroad?
So when we think of the typical freedom seeker, right, it's a young man traveling alone. But we're finding more and more things to take away from that history. That's why I guess I'll talk about the Slave Stampede Project now, because that kind of fits into what we're talking about, ways that we start to depart from kind of these traditional narratives, that we find that more and more that a lot of group escapes were important. And so we started a project working with Dickinson College there in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, looking at these larger group escapes, because after certain points in time, group escapes are actually more popular than kind of the single escape, traveling alone. And of course, there's all kinds of implications, right, from traveling with a group. You're not as, you're kind of not as, you're more conspicuous. Usually there were women and children in that. And we all know, particularly you parents out there, that traveling with children is not an easy thing. And imagine if you are in such a precarious situation trying to travel with children, them quiet and keep them fed. But these escapes were more and more popular during, we see more discussion of them in the late 1840s. And at the same time, when we start to see more discussion of these larger escapes, we also start to see what we see, a push for stronger enforcement of the fugitive slave law, which ultimately culminates in the 1850 fugitive slave law.
It strikes me that the term stampede strikes me as somewhat dehumanizing, right? Where did that come from?
So it's interesting that the term slave stampede enters into the American lexicon almost very soon after the term stampede enters into the American lexicon, right? It enters in the 1840s when there's an expansion out west. It's believed to have Spanish or Germanic roots. And so it just begins in that 19th century to talk about enslaved people escaping in groups, or several escapes from the same location in a kind of a finite space and time. I don't find, like, of course, right, the term stampede conjures up images of uncontrolled and frightened animals, but I don't think it is necessarily derogatory, because we see it being used in newspapers in all sorts of ways. There's a stampede of, people from a certain political party. So that word is just used to kind of refer to any group of people. But I definitely understand people's first thing to go when you're talking about enslaved people and then using a term that likens them to animals to thinking it's derogatory. But I'm just not finding that's necessarily the case so far, and neither has Dr. Pinsker, who is the principal investigator on the project. But these escapes are very interesting, and they receive national attention. They really become enmeshed in political debates regarding slavery and freedom, and you see them being used by both sides, right? Anti-slavery people are using this to kind of detract from these ideas about slavery being a positive benefit and a paternalistic system, because there's nothing more contrast that people aren't happy than a whole bunch of people getting up and escaping at one time. And so it really contradicted kind of these notions about the contented enslaved person. And we see it being used to apply to as few as 3 to upwards of 100 people escaping at the same time. And of course, what's the most interesting thing about these stampedes is they're a borderland phenomenon before the Civil War. They usually happen from borderland states and from border communities within borderland states. And so we know that, borders created unique prospects for escape and flight, and it was often about proximity, right? Escaping was about having that moment to escape. It, of course, involved careful planning, and particularly when you're escaping in a group, but it really was those moments of that proximity to being near free states like Illinois, Ohio, Iowa, all those things. That's what really made those escapes possible, because it's a lot harder to travel with a big group from the deep south to the north than it is to travel from a borderland community where you just have to cross the river and then you're into, quote, a free state.
And Jameson Jenkins, the event he was involved with in 1850 was reported in the Springfield papers as a slave stampede. The numbers vary, 11 to 14 or so from St. Louis on up through. So the Jameson Jenkins is part of this larger slave stampede study. And how
does Jenkins go about then helping 14 people? Because again, it's conspicuous, right?
Right. Well, his line of work was a drayman, so he was a teamster. He hauled goods for a living. So that was I think there was someone in Jacksonville who was also associated with the Underground Railroad, who's also a drayman. So that was a good line of work to be in if you want to do those kinds of things. And Day had mentioned earlier how this was not quite always as secretive as what we think with the Underground Railroad, and Jenkins was identified in the paper as being associated with this event. A little confused in his association with it, but so he helped the destination, the more immediate destination was Bloomington, and from there then maybe there was others that helped that group get further north. Now, not all of that group made it. Some were taken back to St. Louis, but some did.
And do we know if Jenkins was ever prosecuted in his involvement?
There's no record of that. No.
Interesting. Joe, any other questions?
Yes, we continue to invite your questions here. We're with you here on this Thursday evening from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, talking about the Underground Railroad and the Illinois Freedom Project. Bill checking in with us tonight, a question that I'm sure some people are thinking about. What kept Lincoln from supporting abolitionism in the 1840s and 1850s?
Jake, do you want to take that one?
Well, yeah, I got you from the Lincoln home here. We could both tackle it. Part of it is he's a politician in Illinois where abolitionism isn't popular, right? He's not going to end his career, so he's doing this delicate dance. So he condemns the vote that condemns abolitionism, but also within the statement. Keeps abolitionists, criticizes abolitionism and keeps them at arm's length in the 1830s. So he's doing this dance both against slavery but not abolitionism, and he continues to do that dance all the way up until his election, when he says he has no intention of touching slavery where it currently exists.
He, of course, very much adhered to the rule of law and felt that the institution, even though he didn't care much for it at all, was protected by the Constitution, and only through the Constitution could slavery end. And I think he further felt that if it was contained into those states where it already existed, not allowed to expand into the Western territories, it would end on its own. Now, we're looking back on Lincoln's positions here. We cringe a little bit sometimes in how he felt, but he had to, as Jake said, navigate a political climate here, especially in Illinois, as we've heard, that was very much a mixed bag. And so then the events of the war as President Lincoln, then he moved further on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a mixed bag in Illinois. In Alton, Illinois, Elijah Lovejoy in 1837 has 3 printing presses thrown in the river, and then he's shot trying to defend the third one. And Lincoln, in his Lyceum speech in 38, mentions that he is vehemently against people having their printing presses thrown in the river and being shot at, clearly referring to Lovejoy. But yeah, Illinois is a mixed bag, almost puts it mildly, I think. Yeah.
We have Mary checking in, wanting to know if any of you have heard of or know the story of Father Augustine Tolton in Quincy.
Where do I begin?
Yeah, don't get Day started on...
Let's get Day started.
So that is a site, when I said there's only 25 listed in Illinois, that I would definitely like to see represented. I think that's such an important story that not many people know of, about the first African-American priest and here in the United States. And him and his family escaped during the Civil War and made it to Quincy, Illinois. And so I think it's an important story, and, he's up for canonization. So it connects so many different things on the Underground Railroad. So I would love to see it represented. I have had a few starts and stops with people willing to work on applications. And then there's a question of whether his burial, which is there in Quincy, will be moved to someplace else. So that also sometimes is an obstacle to us getting it listed, but it's such an important site. I would also like to see the farm where he escaped from in Missouri, outside of Hannibal, listed. So that is what, and I think that's one of the things that people don't understand. The Underground Railroad continued during the Civil War, right? Even though we hear the Emancipation Proclamation, right? And, it wasn't like, it was by words rather than means. People still found the need to escape. And, living in Missouri, which was not a state that was in rebellion, we still see those people would have still needed to escape on the Underground Railroad. So I think the Underground Railroad, there's more Underground Railroad activity during the Civil War because there's more opportunities with the Union encampments, people being able to flee by Union lines. And even we have a story there in Elgin. I don't know that many people know this story, that during the Civil War, that people were working, there were what they called contraband trains that were sent throughout Illinois, where there were sympathetic soldiers who were working in the South. They saw the horrible conditions that were there in the contraband camps. And I think it was Stanton that arranged for trains, and the Illinois Central train was used to transport people who had escaped to Union lines up to Illinois, and their labor was needed because guess what? A lot of the men were fighting in war, so they provided important labor. So one of those stops were 2 boxcars were transported to Elgin, Illinois, and they were able to 110 people were transported by train to Elgin, Illinois. That's kind of the development and kind of proliferation of the African-American community there. And one of the sites listed in the network is actually the site where the church that those freedom seekers established there at Elgin was located, which is now a park called Newsom Park, which kind of is a commemoration to not only that story, but the larger story of African-Americans in Elgin.
We have John Henry tonight watching from Gary, Indiana, and says each of us are all invited to attend the U.S. President Abraham Lincoln Floral Remembrance Ceremony coming up Saturday, July 17th at 1 p.m. at the Lincoln Tomb State Historic Site here in Springfield. So that's coming up on July 17th. But he also has a question. You mentioned Elgin, which is up in the Chicagoland area, asking, were there any Underground Railroad sites between Chicago and Springfield, kind of in what you think of the I-55 corridor? Such a prominent, was first a rail line linking St. Louis to Chicago with Springfield in the middle. Of course, Bloomington also prominent, and Route 66, later I-55, developed along that corridor. Were there any locations on the Underground Railroad and such, what we think of as such a crucial transportation link in Illinois?
Yeah, I'm glad we got that question. I think we should end that question with Chicago as well, because I don't think we've gotten to Chicago yet, and that's an incredibly important spot. But I'll let Day take it.
Yeah. Of course, there's stops all along the way. I'm trying to geographically orient myself to kind of list some of the stops, and I'm blanking right now. But I know there are stops that are in between. Maybe Tim can help me right now fill in some of those.
Yeah, wasn't another important place was Wheaton College, I think.
Sacred spaces again.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
Wheaton College was definitely an important stop there. We also have, why am I blanking on? It's in Will County. Will County had several different. There was the Sheldon Peck House up that way. That was a stop on the Underground Railroad. So of course there had to be stops because people have to get north, and so that would be. And if you go west, there's of course Knox County, and sometimes people took different routes to get up to Chicago and different places. But yeah, there definitely was some routes. There's definitely a lot in Chicagoland. One of the sites that was recently listed, which we don't hear a lot about, are the involvement of the Dutch there. And there was a farm called the Tun Farm. It's no longer standing. But the Dutch were very important in the Chicagoland. There was not only the Ton family, but the Kuiper family was very involved in the Underground Railroad. They were a family of Dutch immigrants that had moved to the Chicago area. So I think, sometimes we're limited in how we think about what people were involved in the Underground Railroad, but there's so many more stories of different groups that were involved in the Underground Railroad.
Great. Joe, are there any other audience questions? No, we're good right now. Then let's get to a question that I was hoping I'd get to ask. Right now, I believe streaming, possibly on one of the streaming services, is a TV show about the Underground Railroad, which I think, and I'm not going to spoil anything because I haven't seen an episode of it yet, but I believe that it's fictionalized as an actual railroad. But I would want to talk more broadly about depictions of the Underground Railroad in popular culture. Do you think some of the misconceptions folks in general have about the Underground Railroad come from those popular cultural representations?
Yes, most definitely. Popular culture is kind of one of our first ways that we learn about history. And of course, as much as I would like to say that, oh, for those of you who have read Underground Railroad, it's a great book. And I think, there's a historical inaccuracies in everything in popular culture. I mean, even for those of you who are Batman fans, right, Wayne Manor is supposedly built over a cave that was used on the Underground Railroad. But I don't get, even as a historian, I'm not too unhappy about popular culture depictions, because I think they do something that we as historians aren't always able to do, is pique people's interest in history. And so maybe you don't learn exactly the facts, but that may drive you to learn more about the Underground Railroad and find out more about this history. I'm just thinking of my own, I'll just tell a personal story. The first remembrance I have about learning about the Underground Railroad is a Disney TV show came on, and it was about the Underground Railroad. It was about, why am I blanking on the name? I always remember the show. And of course, when I'm put on the spotlight, you can't even get it anymore. But I watched that show, and I was forever, that's my first impression of the Underground Railroad. Oh, it's going to bother me. And so I'll, if somebody asks, I will send it, because I even try to get a copy, because even though popular culture may get the historical details, I think sometimes we get, as historians, we can get so bogged down into the minutia of what history is. But sometimes the bigger ideas are what's important. Like in that particular TV show, right, they're talking about people escaping, people relying on, they go to a free African-American community. So it shows this larger thing about cooperation, multiracial cooperation. It shows the things of Black agency. So I think sometimes we shouldn't get bogged down in kind of the historical minutia of popular culture, but look at the larger ideas that they're telling us that are really relevant to the history and the stories that we're trying to tell, because I think those impact people in ways that really can be profound. And I'm just thinking, I love popular culture personally. And so I'm not sometimes, I get so disappointed, and then I just have to take a moment and go, relax, really release, and then go, what is the larger cultural work that these things are doing that I may be not able to do as a historian? And in that way, I think they can really be provocative and do something really intentional that really kind of spark people's interest in history. So I never want to belie popular culture. I've actually created a list of almost every TV show, every movie that in any way deals with the Underground Railroad. I mean, we see the Underground Railroad in shows like The Simpsons. We see, you know what I mean? It teases people's interest, and maybe it gets someone to think about something in ways that they would not get from going to a historic site or from reading academic books. So it can really be exciting. So I'm not one to poo-poo popular culture. I know people are upset about this being an actual railroad, but if we look at what is happening at some of those stops, what are the larger concepts that he's trying to talk to us about, both enslavement and Black freedom and the history of racism in our country, those are really interesting and thought-provoking things.
All right. Well, if we were playing trivia tonight, we phoned a friend. It was a 1987 Disney movie of the week on the old Disney Sunday night movies. It was called The Liberators.
Thank you. That is it. That is it.
Did you come up with that yourself, Joe, or does that come from the audience?
Well, there's a little thing called Wikipedia. I know it's not the most, but for pop culture, you can usually rely on it pretty good. Plus, there's a section of Disney Wikipedia fandom. So I'm fairly, and of course, as soon as you, and Mary just responded saying it was The Liberators as well. Okay, a couple of quick questions or comments here. Margaret says, I'm so glad I got to see this program tonight. I found out how much I've never heard about. As a kid long ago, my vision was basements and sneaking to the next stop in the dark. That was from school and even from sites I visited, so thank you for the enlightenment there. Of course, Mary chimed in just as I was giving the answer. She knew it too, The Liberators from Disney. But here's a good one from Missy, and I think the three of you would probably have at least one or two ideas here. A lot of folks wanting to get their summer reading going here. Missy says, are there any books that you would recommend to learn more about the Underground Railroad, and in particularly the Underground Railroad in Illinois?
Well, there's Turner's book, right, Dave, on Illinois. I can't think of the name. Lynette Tilly Turner.
It's called the Underground Railroad in Illinois.
Okay, there you go. I knew it.
It's a bit on the nose, yeah.
Yeah, they really went out on a limb for that
right,
title.
That's right.
Yeah, and our friend there, Larry McClellan, has a book that's out about the Underground Railroad in the Chicagoland area that I would say check out. If you it depends what you are looking for, but of course, there's a new book out by Jennifer L. Harbour, which is talking more about kind of the larger African American involvement in kind of the freedom struggle. And she had on the cover of the book is the underground, that painting of Jones, John and Mary Jones. And so that it's not completely focused on the Underground Railroad, but I think, one of the things that a lot of scholars are starting to look at is that the Underground Railroad, people's participation, activism in the Underground Railroad was just one part of a larger activism. And so I think that's what a lot of books are teasing out. If you want to know more about African American communities involved in the Underground Railroad, Cheryl LaRoche's book, Geographies of Resistance is a good one. I can send you, if you email me, which I think they'll show our email at the end there, you can email me and I will send you our bibliography of some Underground Railroad reading. And of course, I would say, one of the early essays on the Underground Railroad in Illinois is, of course, Larry Guerra's article on the Underground Railroad in Illinois. And, he was instrumental in getting us to start looking at African American agency in the Underground Railroad. So there's a lot out there, but those are just some that you could look at, and I'd be happy to send you more.
And I might add in there, too, the Network to Freedom site contains, of course, the listing of sites all over the country, but also, I think, Dave, isn't that right, that also some of the nominations that are scanned are available, the forms, and that's just... that's data, but there's great narratives in there, too.
And excellent resources for teachers as well, I would imagine, too. We always have a good number of educators watching our programs.
Yeah, speaking of which, we have a few of those websites that Tim and Day talked about. Here you can stay connected with the National Park Service. There's the websites for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Also, you can check out that on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Likewise, for the Lincoln Home National Historic Sites website listed there, and you can find more about the Lincoln Home National Historic Site at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And Tim, do you have a slide? Day mentioned her email address. Do we have one on there?
Oh, I think is the general email. If you go to our website, you can find my email there.
Okay, so and we've got the general website for the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. So just go there and look for Day Johnson's email address, and she'll be able to get you more information that she alluded to in just a moment. Well, Day, Tim, Jake, very informative program as always tonight. Any other final thoughts here as we wrap up this look at the Underground Railroad and the Illinois Freedom Project?
Well, I just might add on the Illinois Freedom Project. Day had talked about agency and taking action on the part of the folks historically, and so that's really a lesson that we want to pass along to young people today, is that agency and people who are in a situation who did not let that situation define them, and they took action, did what they could to change their situation and the situation of those around them. So that's really one of the main lessons or what we're trying to convey with the Illinois Freedom Project, too, is using the stories of the past and places to inspire young people today.
Fantastic.
I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you all for joining us, our panel tonight. And thank all of you for watching on Facebook around the state and around the country. Be sure to keep updated on what's going on with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Just go to our website, presidentlincoln.illinois.gov, and you can check on the events page to see all the great programs we have coming up, both of historical interest related to the Lincoln legacy and the Civil War in Illinois history, but programs on education, different avenues for your children to learn and enrich themselves about the history of Lincoln and Illinois, all right there for you on the events tab at presidentlincoln.illinois.gov. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois.